Ons is terug. Trudi Makhaya is 'n ekonoom en konsultant by Mercantile Bank en ons bespreek nou wetgewing en beleide van die regering om spesifiek entrepreneurskap te help bevorder. Hallo Trudi. Trudi, if we look at the National Development Plan, it says that we should, small and medium-sized businesses should generate 90% of all jobs by 2030. Is that going to be possible?
No, we're far from that. We still have a bias towards large corporates. And especially since the financial crisis, we've seen a trend where the large corporates have been recovering, but small businesses have actually been declining in terms of the employment levels. Yeah. So we're actually going in the opposite direction at the moment.
Yeah. So we know that startup failure rates are worldwide a problem. Do we see exactly the same in South Africa, and are we any worse off?
I think we're worse. So we're seeing at about 70% failure rate, sure. Which is, on the high end. If you look at the global entrepreneurship monitor across the world, it is high, but I think in South Africa we have a particular problem. Yeah. You can trace it to many things. As I said, the dominance of large corporates. On one hand, it's a very sophisticated economy. On the other, it's very difficult to gain a foothold. Obviously, there are issues around education and skills that also make it difficult because a lot of industries that are high performing now tend to be in services or tend to require, a high level of numeracy, a high level of technical skill that, the education system just isn't delivering.
Yeah. Let's quickly have a look at what the president said in his SONA about entrepreneurship.
We will improve our capacity to support black professionals and deal decisively with companies that resist transformation, and we will use competition policy to open up the market up to new black entrants and invest in the development of businesses in our townships as well as in our rural areas.
So the state is probably the single biggest procurer in the country. So that should be an easy win for the state. And we know it's always been policy that the state says will procure from small business. Where is the state with that policy?
So the target is 30% of all procurement to go to small business. And also not just to procure, but to support businesses when you procure. So, for instance, the perennial issue that we talk about in terms of paying on time, being supportive of entrepreneurship. I think we still have some way to go. Unfortunately, I would say over the past 9 years, you've also had instances where funds that should go to productive entrepreneurs have been diverted to, businesses that are not small. They might be new, but not necessarily adding to entrepreneurship. So I think we have that challenge that it has to be genuine entrepreneurs that are getting the support from government. You also find strange practices where government still imports things that could easily be localized. So, in terms of strategically using buying power, I think government is aware of what needs to be done. Yeah. But I think filtering it down to that low-level procurement manager to understand you don't take the easy way out, try to procure from a small business and also do it in an open and transparent way.
The Black Industrialist Program, it was spearheaded by Jeff Radebe, who was the previous minister in the presidency. This was aimed at the higher end of the market with some successes. What was the initial aim with this?
So the idea was that black economic empowerment, we've had it for quite some time now. And what it's produced are minority shareholders, in essence, and a few of them. You're not getting entrepreneurs who are operational in their businesses, who are focused on, one or two businesses, spend most of their time in it and grow it to become, say, a national champion. So the idea was that instead of focusing on people and giving them financial backing to go acquire 1% here, 5% here, rather help somebody to build a plant, somebody who's going to be employing people, somebody who's going to be operational. So kind of a real industrialist. Yeah. And so about 30 billion rand was put aside to do that. I think it's gaining some traction now. Initially, they did struggle, I think, to find good entrepreneurs. But now you're hearing, I know of a company, for instance, called Maneli, which works in pet food and, you know, exports to international market, is building a huge plant.
Yeah.
There are other success stories in pharmaceuticals, in retail. So you're starting to see that, you know, there are industrialists who are coming up, but the question always is, you know, do they have the right access to markets?
So a big thing in the States was obviously supporting startup businesses through venture capital funding. We're trying to do more or less the same through our venture capitalist incentive scheme, which is a tax incentive scheme. How does that work?
So that was trying to get people to form venture capital companies that would then look out for startups, because there's a big gap. You know, you've got a lot of private equity established that looks at maybe deals above 100 million or so. But this was trying to incentivize and to give people a tax break for investing in small businesses, for those funds to form and then invest in small businesses. Initially, it was very slow take-up. Some amendments were done to make it easier. And there are further amendments that are going to come to also lower the threshold for a small business that can be supported, also deal with how, you know, certain definitions are done in terms of connected entities, and all of it to make it easier to get money to startups.
Yeah. We know that Minister Rob Davies is, and he's repeating this idea around a special economic development zone. How will these zones actually work?
So the idea there is that you try to relieve business of all of the regulation and taxes that the rest of the economy faces. So you create a zone, you know, China has done this quite successfully, where, for instance, you know, firms can get away with paying lower wages, or alternatively be given a subsidy for employment, but paying the same level of wages, not subject to the same level of labor laws, and giving them all sorts of relocation incentives to be there. You want to insulate them, so you don't want them to undercut other businesses, so you declare them to be in the zone, and ideally they should produce and export, so that they don't distort the local market. So a lot of thinking has come into that. I think the labor legislation was a bit of a sensitive point, but I think we're moving on where government is saying we'll actually just subsidize employers who are in these zones.
So one thing that got the analysts talking was the president saying in his opening speech, and he talked about a jobs summit. So he seems to like summits. Do we have any idea what his aim is with this summit?
I think the issue that we have is that when we have economic growth, we have employment growth, but it's much slower than economic growth. So I think maybe concentrating minds to say, how do we get jobs-rich economic growth? So how do we encourage companies to, for instance, not go the full fourth industrial revolution of automation, but still maintain high levels of employment? How do we ensure that we have sectors, we have growth in sectors that generate jobs? So if you look at even the pre-crisis time, agriculture and mining were not part of the growth story. They were actually already struggling. So how do we get those industries? How do we get an industry like tourism to contribute more, simply because it's more labor intensive? Because we have a bias towards capital intensive industries or skill intensive industries. And I think if the summit can try to think, how do we come up with a plan that moves away from that and has more labor intensive growth, we would have achieved a lot.
The last thing is the Small Business Innovation Fund. Do we have any idea what that is about?
So the only thing that's clear is that, you know, government is moving away from just focusing on survivalist small business to support even innovative, high potential small businesses. So it's not seen as a grant or a nice thing to do for people to have employment, but it's actually saying we want to create, you know, I don't know, the Googles, the Facebooks, whatever, the more innovative, intellectually property-driven kind of small businesses.
Absolutely. Well, it seems all over the show, so let's hope that with the new president that there's some more clear direction. Trudy, thank you so much. Na die breek kuier ons in Wellington by die dogter van Funky Ouma. Die speel se naam verwys na ouma Anneke wat haar resep vir 'n gesonde sout in 'n besigheid omskep het. Bly gerus ingeskakel.